Hi, I'm Julie Ross.
And I'm Gregory Abbey.
And you're listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast.
Julie is a longtime parent educator and counselor.
And Greg is an actor, writer, and director, and more importantly, a parent just like you.
Through conversations covering a range of different topics, challenges, and roadblocks, we hope to give you a few of Julie's tools that might just help make parenting a little bit easier.
Look, nobody's perfect, and parenting is challenging, to say the least. With a few skills under our belts, though, we might just be able to be good enough parents and enjoy the journey and our children a little bit more in the process.
Okay, episode 3.
All right.
You ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, let's do it. So today we're talking about pandemic burnout.
Right.
Which is, I'm sure, is going on everywhere for parents, right?
Yeah. I mean, here's what I think nobody expected the pandemic to really go on this long and get even worse than what it was in the beginning. It's a little bit like at the beginning, I think everybody kind of, pulled up their bootstraps and said, okay, we can get through this. We're just going to do what we need to do. And, we'll get to the summer and then it'll be all good. And unfortunately, 9 months in, 10 months in,
we're still going.
We're still going. And the problem with that is that people in families have been cooped up together for a very long time.
Yes.
I know you know that.
Yes.
And the workload for parents has increased, not only because of, maybe both parents are working to begin with.
Sure.
But the workload in the house has increased because now parents are also having to keep track of the kids' schedules. Who's remote? Who's in person? Who's synchronous? Who's asynchronous?
Right.
Who's supposed to be up at 8:30 attending a class?
Sure. And now kids are, a lot of kids are home, so you're managing the kids. Now, can you talk a little bit about, because I know you gave a talk recently, and are you hearing, are you getting a lot of this in the groups and stuff? What has prompted this episode for us, would you say?
I'm getting a lot of it. I'm hearing exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing the word burnout. I'm hearing anxiety, depression.
And do you think that's from the repetition of this, the unendingness of it?
I do. I think, it's interesting, Greg. I think we weren't prepared. I think families weren't prepared to create a more equitable division of labor in the family.
Okay. That's a very polite way of saying it. I like that. What did you call it? An equitable division of labor?
An equitable division of labor.
Right.
So what I mean by that is there's a lot of work that goes into creating and maintaining a healthy, happy family. And I think we have to think about family as being a living organism.
Okay.
So it's greater than the sum of its parts. And if one of the people in the family, one of the parts of the family is suffering, it affects the entire family and the entire family's health.
Mm-hmm.
So before the pandemic, I think part of the labor of the family was perhaps taken on by schools. Mm-hmm. In other words, kids left the house at whatever, 8 or 8:30.
Yeah, right.
And then the parents really could kind of figure out, whether they were going to their own jobs or whether they were, using that time for personal enrichment or whether they were going grocery shopping or whatever. But they had this block of time where the kids were out
gone
from underfoot.
Right, and someone was sort of taking care of them in a sense because they're in class. Maybe they're going to play dates after school. They're going to their soccer teams, their activities.
Yes.
So now all of that is eliminated. So you have all that planning and activity stuff that parents do anyway, but now it's kind of tenfold.
Well, exactly. So the problem becomes that when kids moved back into the household, right, and weren't in school, there was additional labor that had to happen.
Sure.
And I want to talk a little bit about the different components of labor because there's some that's very obvious and there's some that's not obvious.
Okay.
But I think what happened was nobody thought about how are we going to now divide this labor up in terms of the adults in the family or maybe in terms of the kids, depending on their ages. How are we going to divide this extra labor up where the kids may be barging in on a parent when they're working and, who takes care of that and, whose responsibilities.
I'm sure we'll get to this, but so we're not kind of dancing around this. And I think to me, I'm already sort of understanding and knowing, even from my own marriage and relationship, where the crux of the weight is landing.
Right.
Because you said there's been articles, right, specifically about mothers. And I don't know how we want to characterize like an cisgender family, because obviously there's different kinds of families in this world. But there has literally been hard data about mothers and moms suffering more from depression, anxiety, or how am I characterizing that wrong?
You are. So, I do want to be specific or clear that we're talking about cisgender heterosexual relationships. This is the research that's been done is on cisgender heterosexual relationships. So a study came out and was reported on by NPR in September that 865,000 women had dropped out of the workforce during the pandemic.
Now, they're dropping out because why? Because the needs at home became too strong with kids being at home? Is that part of it?
Yes, and I think, we still live in a society where if someone has to drop out of the workforce, generally speaking, it's the woman who is being paid less than the man, and so they may come to an agreement in a marital situation that the man should continue working and that the woman should drop out. I think, and I think we have to be clear that part of that is the burnout that women are experiencing, because generally speaking, the different components that go into the work of the family are both visible and invisible. So the physical labor is visible. That's making a meal. That's driving the kids to soccer. That's having a job and bringing home money from that job.
Is making the schedules for doctor's appointments, or is that visible?
No, that is generally invisible.
Okay.
And part of what we call the mental load for people. So the mental load refers to keeping track of all of that stuff. Who has a doctor's appointment coming up? Who's on Zoom learning today? Who drank up the last of the milk in the refrigerator? What grocery supplies need to be purchased so that we can make meals this next week?
That's part of the invisible load that goes on.
Yes, the invisible mental load, because there's another component as well. And I think what people don't often realize is that part of the invisible mental load is even one person saying to another, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go to the grocery store and pick up X, Y, and Z.
I've heard this one in my own relationship. So
really?
Well, yeah, this idea that that's still a lot of work. And so if my thing is like, just tell me what you need me to do and I'll do it.
Right.
Which is great. And I'll go out and do that. But I've definitely heard like, I still have to do the work of now telling you.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And
so right now we're sort of going through maybe what the load is, right? We're sort of naming what the loads can be within the family.
Right. And then I want to talk about a couple more statistics, because I do want to get back to why 865,000 women have dropped out of the workforce. So the mental load is one thing. And then the third component is the emotional labor that goes into being in a family.
And what do you mean by that, the emotional labor?
So that really refers to who is the person who maybe feels guilty if the kids aren't doing right. And they might have a tendency to say, what did I do wrong? How come? What is my contribution? Why did my kid get an F in this class? Why is my kid smoking weed? Why, if my kid isn't typically developing, is it possible that I did something that is creating that atypical development? And there's a lot of guilt around that.
So that's an extra weight that's on top of all this other weight. Okay.
And it could be guilt. It could be worry about how are they doing. I'm not sure how the school situation's going. Are they suffering? It could be sadness. This is one thing that I hear a lot, Greg, is how sad some parents are about the things their kids are missing out on.
Are losing out on, yeah.
Whether it's summer camp or their first prom or whatever. Heartbreakingly, I had a mom just the other day say that she was reprimanding her oldest, who's a senior in high school, about being a little too uncautious, if that's a word, about, kind of partying and stuff. And the daughter turned to her and said, "Mom, you had a prom. I will never have a prom." And that broke my heart to hear that,
Yeah.
And the mom is so sad about that.
Right. So this is a real mental health crisis that's going on. Right?
Oh, yeah. And generally speaking, there's one person in the family that bears the mental load and the emotional labor in the family. And I ask, every family is unique, Greg, and I hate to gender things because I hate to gender things.
Yeah, of course. But sometimes that's the way it falls, right?
Well, in cisgender heterosexual relationships,
right,
what the research is showing is that over 50% of mothers have felt exhausted, depressed, socially isolated, anxious in the past week, several times per week. That's over 50% of mothers compared to 35% of their male counterparts.
Wow.
So to me, that says something about who's bearing the load in the family.
Right, of course.
And generally speaking, again, in cisgender heterosexual relationship, that load is borne by the mother.
Can you reiterate what the loads are again?
Sure. So physical load.
Okay.
Right. That's the actual.
A couple examples of that again?
Sure. So physical load is the actual doing of things.
Right.
So it's making the meal, shuttling the kids to soccer when there was soccer. It can be having a job, so something you actually get paid for. It's visible. It's
sure.
You can see it.
Doing the laundry, folding all of the clothes.
Correct.
Putting out all the Christmas decorations,
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
So that's physical. Then there's the invisible, which you said is the scheduling. So whether it's the doctor's appointments, we have 3 kids in 3 different schools, so it's kind of managing all those emails and the parent advisories and setting all that up. So
exactly.
That's invisible.
And, right. And having that on your mind all the time. And if you have to delegate that to somebody else, that's
right.
also part of the mental load
sure.
that we're talking about. And
then you said and then the emotional
And then
load.
there's the emotional. Now, quite obviously, there's no way to equitably divide up the emotional load, because I can't say to you,
you're responsible for my emotional.
Right. I can't say I'm really worried about the kids. You worry about it for a while. I wish.
Especially if I'm like, I'm not worried. What are you worried about?
I know. Exactly.
So it seems like this is kind of obvious, but if we're falling into these sort of, maybe you could call it cliched tropes, but that are real, it just seems like whether we like it or not, part of that is that we've all just been socialized that way, right?
Right.
Women have been socialized in a certain way. Men have been socialized in a certain way. I will sit on this side of the table and have to represent the patriarchy today, which I'm not sure I want to take that on, but I will. But joking aside, it's actually very real, right?
It is very real. And we think we've come a long way, Greg, but we haven't really come a long way.
Right.
And the reality is that men still generally make more than women in the workplace.
Right.
The reality is that we were socialized where, even as when I was growing up in the 60s, 50s and 60s.
Oh, definitely.
Women stayed at home and took care of the kids.
Sure.
And men went off from 9 to 5. They left the house at 8:30 and went to, from 9 to 5 and came home by 5:30. So the labor was divided up into dad doing the paid work that was visible and mom doing all of the invisible, unpaid work.
Yeah. I had a very traditional, even though I would say the power balance between my parents was the same, maybe emotionally, but my father was in the Air Force. He left the house by like 7 a.m. He came home at 6. My mother was sort of the homemaker. So she did all the cooking and the cleaning, the organizing, the scheduling. And so then when you grow up with that, you can't but inherently take it on. I have one sister and she constantly still gives me a hard time because she felt like my mother did things for me that she didn't do for her. You know what I mean? Picked up after me or whatever it was.
Right.
So you're carrying that, of course, you're sort of carrying that historically, psychologically into your adulthood. I know my wife has said to me that when we walk into the house, she said this to me a number of times, she intrinsically looks around because she'll get frustrated with me because I'll come in and I'll go in and I'll get on my computer or do whatever I'm doing, where she comes in and intrinsically thinks what needs to be done in the house.
Right.
Like it's sort of in her, right?
Yeah, because women are generally used to having to keep track of all of that stuff. So, I don't want to say that it's intentional on the part of men. I think it's subconscious. I think you're absolutely right. It's historical. Somebody's going to take care of that for me.
Well, and the other thing is, and I was thinking about this when we were talking about doing this episode, is that to try to, because I'm on the other side as the man in the relationship, and I've been thinking about this a lot because of how it goes on in my own dynamic in my marriage, but women bring this historical context into today and this historical stuff that went on with the patriarchy, with how they were socialized in 50s, 60s, 70s. But men are also bringing this idea of what masculinity is and what it is to be a man, and this idea of vulnerability, because a lot of that is based around a vulnerability in terms of, and I think we'll get to like, how do we work through this, right?
Right, yeah.
So a man is bringing that because you've been socialized to like hunt, earn, whatever it is. Does that make sense?
Yes, and typically men have been shamed.
Right.
For having feelings at all, other than anger.
Right.
Typically, men are allowed to feel angry and nothing else, and women are allowed to feel everything but anger.
Well, and ironically, always underneath that anger is sort of usually some hurt or sadness or whatever it is. But yeah, that's been sort of celebrated in society. So now these two things are coming together, and then I was thinking that. If the question is, so now we're in the pandemic and this has gone on in a reality, we have stats that shows, like you said, that the women are taking on more. And so tell me if this makes sense, because I would think under this stressful circumstance of the pandemic that we may, even if it's totally unconscious, sort of divert to the roles that maybe we understand or are comfortable with or society is comfortable with. And you can say no, that I'm totally off.
No, I don't think you're totally off. I think the answer to that is yes. And I think part of the burnout that we're seeing among mothers in particular has to do with layering on feelings of anger and resentment, that they're having to revert back to roles that they probably thought that they had moved past.
You mean that anger and resentment has built up? I mean, I think it can be there generally anyway, but you're saying has built up over the pandemic.
Yes, I would say so. I think it's probably predates the pandemic, to tell you the very honest truth. But like I said, when we're looking at pre-pandemic life, we're looking at some of the stress being relieved by the fact that the kids are out of the house for a huge portion of the day, right? So it may have been there, but not as evident before the pandemic. And now...
Yeah, because these aren't uncommon conversations in terms of a division of labor within a marriage or a relationship. Like, that goes on regardless of a pandemic.
I think that the conversations don't go on at all. I think that's part of the problem.
What do you mean?
I don't think...
Like very rarely that women and men or
partners, spouses,
have
whatever,
that conversation.
Sure. No, I think any more than the conversation potentially about how are we going to raise children.
Your general feeling is it doesn't go on enough, if at all?
Correct. I don't think anybody sits down. I don't want to say anybody. I don't think, generally speaking, people sit down and say, what are your values with regard to raising children? What are your values with regard to division of labor in the household? When I've been talking about this in the past months, when it started to come up as burnout in the pandemic, when I've been talking about the loads, people...
And you're hearing that from people too. They're saying, I'm really struggling.
Yeah. And when I say, well, there's mental load and there's emotional labor, they're grabbing pens and paper to write it down. They're like, I've never heard that before.
Oh.
I've never heard those terms before.
Well, they probably maybe they haven't synthesized it. So they've felt it. It's another thing to be conscious about, like, oh, this is what it is, I guess, is the difference. Because inherently you're feeling all of these feelings. But a lot of times when you end up in therapy or couples therapy, it's because like, I don't know what it is, but I'm feeling terrible.
Yeah.
And this is not working for me.
Yeah. And I find that what's helpful is to define these things and to say, and to really look at it. You know, just this past week, I had a jam-packed week in terms of work. I had no bandwidth to do anything. And as of this episode, we're coming up on Christmas, which is the holiday that we celebrate in our family. And
you can't deal.
I said to my husband, I said, you've got to take the mental load of Christmas. You've got to take the decorations, whatever. I can't deal with it. Mm-hmm. And because we had common language, he knew what I meant when I said the mental load, so that he didn't come back at me and say, well, just tell me what to do. I was like, you need to just know what to do because I don't have it in me. And he took care of it. And it was such a relief. And interestingly enough, Greg, at the end of the week, he said, that was hard. And I said, yeah. And I appreciated his honesty, you know, that he was willing to be vulnerable and say, wow, that is hard, because it typically falls to me to do the whole, you know, holiday celebration thing.
So your sense is that it kind of surprises me, and maybe because, I mean, we're certainly not perfect, but we've had some of those conversations at least, but you feel like partially that's not even going on. And why is that? You think because there's that psychological history, like this is what it is. I'm just so used to this inherently that I don't think about it, that this is how it is.
I think that's part of it, for sure. I think people don't have the language with which to talk about it. And I think that's important, because having the language and knowing how to communicate this in non-combative ways is really important.
So before we move on, is there anything else you want to talk about? So we've talked about sort of what exists, right?
Right.
So what's going on is this sort of, generally, there's been a lot of statistics articles about women feeling this more specifically. We talked about the load that goes on. Is there anything else you want to add before we move on to now, what do you do? So if this exists, how do we fix it, or how do we deal with it?
Right. Well, you know, I think maybe I'd like to insert another example of what this looks like in the general household, because I think, you know, I'm not perfect either, as you said, you know, about your relationships, and I'm not perfect either. But I do think there are ways in which you and your family and I and my family have talked about some of this already. And I don't think the majority of people have. So another example would be, I have a mom that I'm working with, about how she can de-stress some. She works full time, 2 children, everybody's at home, and she and her husband fall into this kind of typical pattern. Mm-hmm. So this is just an example of how I think people are just generally kind of clueless. Men are generally clueless.
It's okay, Julie.
I feel awful saying that.
You shouldn't.
I really
Let's just put it out on the table.
Generally
speaking, I think that's fair.
You know,
I mean, even as someone who thinks of himself as kind of evolved, and I think about feelings and behavior, believe me, there's definitely moments where my wife is like, "You don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah, and again, Greg, I'm talking about cisgender heterosexual men, right? I which is a segment of the population of men, and not the full spectrum. But so she said to her husband, she said, you know what, I need to go out to the local grocery store and get some frozen lasagnas to put in the freezer, right? And he said, why? We can always make lasagna. And she said, We? What's this royal we you're talking about? Have you ever made a lasagna in your life, or helped make a lasagna? I don't think she actually said that last part to him, because it would have been sarcastic, and she's a little bit more evolved than to use.
But he probably said it without even. I'm sure he said it without
thinking.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's like, you know,
no. I lasagna. You eat the lasagna.
Exactly. So, you know, and I think it just speaks to the kind of cluelessness that people don't realize that there's all this work that goes into even making a meal. There's invisible work. Mm-hmm. You know, buying the supplies, finding the time, thinking about when the meal needs to be on the table. So I think this dad, for me, kind of represents the general mindset of kind of food appears and I eat it, as opposed to mom needs to lessen her load. So she's going to buy frozen so that it can just be heated up.
Right. Because he may feel unconsciously entitled because maybe he has a job where he makes a lot of money. And I don't even mean that arrogantly, but we're talking about these sort of roles that you instinctively fall into.
Right.
And it seems like that's part of what needs to be unraveled, especially because it also occurred to me that the thing we haven't mentioned is that on top of everything else, what women have had to battle is the idea that they want a full-time job and a career, and they also want to be parents. And as that's gone on over the last few decades, is finding that balance, and it's wanting to have both, and that's fair. And also expanding for men, that men also, I want to work and make a living, but I don't want to give all of those. You want to be around as a parent as well. And kind of finding those balance, and it's totally messy and it's totally complicated. And society still doesn't recognize it. There's not enough paternal leave, right? I mean, I've never had a real job, corporate job in a while, but from what I understand is that balance is still not even in society.
No, I mean, there are a few corporations and companies out there who have paternal leave for fathers, which is great. But we are, as a country, the United States is really far behind in terms of supporting families, in terms of providing opportunities for childcare that are low cost for families where there's two working parents. There's a lot of places in the world that do far better than we, where, parents are given subsidies to help them with the childcare, or, childcare is provided on premises at the workplace, that's a shame.
So if that's what exists, right? And maybe we have parents that are listening to this episode going, okay, that's all true. I'm really fed up. I'm burnt out. I'm struggling. So now the question is, what can they do? What can parents do?
I think it comes down to communication.
Right.
And that's not something that people are very good at, generally speaking. We weren't taught it in school. I really wish that communication techniques would be taught in school, because it would just benefit everybody. So I think, as the person who might initiate this conversation, right, which I've laughed about with a number of the groups that I've talked about this with, because to initiate the conversation means more mental load.
Right.
It's
here's some more work. Now you have to.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's like,
now you have to bring it up as, yes, it's true. That's definitely not fair, but it's also probably not going to change. And so you have to kind of, unfortunately, maybe take that on.
Yeah. And
because the other partner who's not carrying the load is not going to come to you and say, hey, we really need to talk about this. Right. Generally speaking, I don't think that'll happen.
No, and especially if they're not aware that they're not participating in kind of this equitable division of labor. So it is going to fall on one person, and it's generally going to fall on the person who is already carrying the most load. And I'm sorry. I am sorry to have to say that. The reality, though, is if you can have this communication, it will potentially lessen the mental load and the emotional labor. And we'll talk about how to do that too, Greg, in a minute, because it's two different things. How to reduce that is two different things. But generally speaking, people need to be versed in non-combative language.
Right.
And know what's likely to trigger a defensive response. Because when the folks that I know have approached their partner and said, I feel like I'm having to keep track of all of this, generally their partner says, well, what are you talking about? As we said before, what are you talking about? I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I do whatever you do. I'm perfectly willing.
Are you doing an imitation of me right now? Because I feel like I've been there. Right. No. Well, of course, because no one wants to hear, and it is all in the approach, right? Because I've certainly gotten defensive, especially if you feel like, well, I'm doing so much,
Yes.
I'm doing this and I did this.
Yes. And the first step in diluting a defensive response before it even happens lies in understanding the use of I statements versus you statements. So a you statement is you never think about the schedule for the kids. You forgot to look at the piece of paper that I provided on the, refrigerator.
Right. You're an idiot.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So you're going to get defensive. So this just makes me think So I think that's great. And I want to talk about I statements. So what happens if you have all of this resentment built up, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be really difficult to start that conversation. Because ideally, you're going to be able to come and say, I need to speak to you. Do you have some suggestions? How do you get that out maybe first? Do you talk to a friend, journal? Like, are there some things maybe you should do? Because sometimes ideally, you can say like, okay, I'm going to have this conversation. But a lot of people in a lot of relationships, especially if it's built up, if it was building up anyway, and now during the pandemic, it's gotten worse. Do you have some recommendations around that so you just don't unload on the person?
Sure, because that buildup is representative really of the emotional labor that you've been doing, right? And the way to lessen emotional labor is to talk about it and be acknowledged for it. So if you don't have a partner who, when you say, I'm so worried about the kids, if your partner is likely to say, oh, you're such a worry wart, you're such a negative Nancy, that's going to create resentment, right? That's not going to lessen your emotional labor. So you have to find a person with whom it's safe to express that. You have to find a person who will acknowledge it and embrace it and validate it and say, I get it. I mean, absolutely, of course you're feeling worried, or, it is a worrisome thing, or, all moms or dads, moms generally, all moms feel guilty about, their child's development, and you're not alone, right? And that eases that emotional labor.
Sure, because you're being heard. So if the idea is maybe if you're worried, especially in that initial conversation, you're not going to get that. I imagine obviously you can get that from friends. You can get that from a therapist.
Yes, the one place that you should not get it from is your children.
So
I don't care how old they are.
Expand on that a little bit. This idea that they're not your friends, that you shouldn't turn to them, because I would imagine that's just cause for concern and anxiety for them, right?
Correct. And it results in what we call parentifying the child. And that's asking them to take the burden of your emotions onto themselves, where they need to be free to have their own feelings.
And not have the responsibility. So parentified child means suddenly you're treating them as if they're an equal adult.
Yes, a peer, a friend, as you said. And that really robs children of their childhoods and their young adulthoods. Even when they become young adults, it is not fair to go and unburden yourself emotionally. That's not to say that you can't, let's say somebody dies in the family or somebody dies that and, it's not to say that you can't share your grief and cry with them. But a lot of the time parents try to communicate their negative feelings about the other parent to their child. And it happens, it's terrible. It happens, it happens
often
in divorced families.
Right,
it's
of course.
Like
that's
over
where it
the
gets
top
really
in divorced
tricky.
Families, but it happens
terrible for the child.
And terrible.
I'm sorry. So it happens a lot. What were you going to say?
Oh, it happens a lot in divorced families, but it happens more than you might like to think in intact families as well.
Right.
Even in an intact family where the parents have a good relationship, it's very easy for parents to say, "Oh, your mother again is doing X, Y, or Z," or "Oh, your father, if he would just listen to me the first time," and unloading that on the kid is really detrimental and even dangerous.
Yeah, definitely, because they don't need to be in between that.
No, exactly, and you're creating a conflict of loyalty where they then have to choose sides and carry around this emotional responsibility that it's just not theirs to do.
Right. So obviously you want to avoid it with the child, certainly a friend, a therapist, and you might be able to do it with your partner, but just because I've been in that situation myself, whatever topic it's around, when your resentment is built up, if you're not careful, you start off by slinging.
Yes.
Right? Which feels great in the moment, maybe, but you're not going to really get anywhere.
No.
Right?
In fact, you're going to take lots of steps backwards when you do that.
Right, because then you're going to have to repair that.
Exactly. And, Greg, you mentioned, just a moment ago, something about journaling. And that is a very valid way to unload the emotional labor as well. So if you don't have somebody that you can talk to who's going to validate, it's fine. Put it on a piece of paper.
So okay, so now we're here at the moment. You're going to talk with your partner. This idea that you want to do you don't want to do you statements, because that obviously just puts someone on the defensive.
Yeah.
So talk about I statements a little bit.
So I statements start with I feel, I think, in my opinion. So it might sound like I've been feeling overwhelmed recently keeping track of the kids' remote learning schedules.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as simple as that. Now, I do want to caution our listeners to not do you statements disguised as I statements. So a you statement that's disguised as an I statement might sound something like, I've been really overwhelmed trying to keep up with the kids' schedules because you don't ever do anything with regard to remembering, what those schedules are. So that's a little problematic because you still have the blame and the kind of combative language in there.
Right.
Listen, you're just going to make it easier for yourself to get points across if you're not bringing up defensiveness in the other person. Because once they're defensive, they're not going to listen.
Sure. That window's shut.
Yeah, so you can do it without blaming. You can just say, I've been feeling overwhelmed.
Well, can you talk a little bit about it could go off the rails the first time. Can you remind me, you mentioned this in the first episode, because a lot of this, you're saying the key is obviously communication, the key is listening, that you must first, whose quote is this? You must first seek to understand?
Yes.
Then to be understood?
Yes, that's Stephen Covey's quote.
Okay.
And he said it with regard to he says, the single most important thing that he learned in the field of interpersonal relations is to seek first to understand, then to be understood. And it's such a great quote because we spend most of our time as, whether we're parents or not, when someone else is talking, instead of pure listening, instead of trying to understand them, we're thinking about what to say back.
We're building our response in our head.
Yeah.
Sure. Especially when you feel defensive.
Oh, yeah. Or especially when you're feeling intense about something and you're trying to get a point across and the other person, in this case, the other person may be defensive and not want to listen. And so you don't want to listen in that moment because you want them to understand what you're talking about. But the key really is in stepping back and listening, even if the other person is on the defensive. And I'm not going to tell you it's easy to do.
Well, you said this about something else in the first or second episode, that this isn't some magic wand, especially if you've never done it. If you're telling me that you feel like this literally doesn't really even go on a lot of times between partners, there's probably a good chance that this could really go off the rails and that you need to circle back and do it again. What was the other quote you said about repair, recreates?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's from one of my favorite writers, that quote, Brenda Euland, who said that listening is a magnetic and creative force. And that the people who listen to us are the ones that we're drawn toward, as if to just sit in their radius would do us good. And she says there's an alternating current between speaker and listener, within which ideas begin to come to life and to grow and to expand. And she says the most important part of this is, she said that listening is a process that recreates both the speaker and the listener. So when you step back and listen, even if your partner's being defensive or obnoxious or whatever, when you step back and listen, you're really creating an opportunity to repair a relationship. It's redemptive in nature, to recreate not just yourself and not just giving your partner the chance to recreate themselves, but really to recreate that relationship.
Right.
Super powerful.
Right. And you have an opportunity to do that if it doesn't totally go the way you want it to, maybe in that first conversation with your partner.
Right, exactly.
But it seems like this is the crux, right? So if the idea is that a person in the relationship is suffering in silence, is overwhelmed, it's extreme now because of the pandemic. It's anxiety, it's depression, feeling lost. You're hearing this. There's articles everywhere that this is going on, that you really have to try to engage. Well, first of all, you have to recognize the issue, right?
Yep.
And then you have to engage with the partner. And it's really about focusing on your feelings as opposed to attacking the other person, even though you really might want to lay into them.
Right. Because when you focus on your feelings, you don't give them anything to argue with. It's very difficult to say to a person. It's easy to say to a person. So if I were to say to you, I do all the work in the house, it's easy then for that to be argued with, right? Or you never do anything. It's easy for that to be argued
Sure,
with.
And then it's just a fight.
Right. But to say, I feel overwhelmed keeping track of the kids' schedules.
Well, unless you're a real jerk and you say, you don't feel that way.
Correct.
And then you're in trouble.
Well, then that says something about the relationship.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Absolutely. And I certainly know relationships where that has been the case.
Sure.
You know, I would hope that the majority of relationships aren't dealing with that kind of dysfunction, is what I would call it.
Well, and I think another avenue, if parents find themselves that it becomes impossible, that they can't find a way, that it doesn't work, that they argue, that couples therapy is a really great place. Because I think what couples therapy can do is you might not solve the dynamic, whatever it is that you have issues with, but you can get some more tools around how to communicate. So it's really, I feel like ultimately it's about how do we treat each other, right? So we can be heard. So parents shouldn't be afraid. It's easy to say in New York City because everyone's in therapy in New York City, but that's another resource, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it can be helpful to have somebody who can mediate.
Right.
To have someone who is an impartial, neutral observer, right? And somebody that both people trust. I think it's a very valuable service to seek out if you're really at that kind of odds. Standstill. Yeah.
Right. So maybe we can wrap up with it's wind out of the sail.
Take the sail out of the wind.
All right, you're gonna have to. What is this? I'm lost. So talk to me. Talk to me.
Well, so when we encounter defensiveness on the part of somebody else, the goal is to take the sail out of the wind, and I'm very particular about that. It's not take the wind out of the sail. So think about this. Think about the other person's defensiveness being the wind, right? And if you're in a sailboat out in the open water and your sail is unfurled, right, to catch the wind, if a big, strong typhoon comes up, you're not going to leave your sail unfurled because you will be capsized.
Sure.
So what you want to do when that big wind comes up, that defensiveness comes up, you want to tie that sail to the mast as quickly as possible.
Is it the person who's being defensive that ties the sail to the mast?
No, it's the person against whom the wind is pushing.
And how do they tie that sail down in this analogy?
By stepping back and listening.
Even if the person is being defensive?
Yes.
Okay.
And then that leads to what I call the box step of communication, which is a great tool in an oppositional sort of communication that may be happening.
Okay.
So the other person gets defensive.
Right.
You take a step back. So just like the box step, you step back, you step to the side, you step forward.
So consciously catch yourself as opposed to engaging. So then you're in a battle of wills. If you can do this, which might be hard, but you take a step back.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's the equivalent of taking the sail out of the wind. So don't respond in that moment. Don't say, I can't believe you're, because then that sail is out and you're going to get capsized. So you take a step back and you start the listening process. And for me, having a box step in my head helps me keep track of where I am in this process. So you take a step back and you start to listen. Now, what are you listening for? You're listening, and this is the stepping to the side part. You're listening for something that you can agree with.
Okay.
That the other person's saying. So maybe they're saying, I can't believe you're accusing me of...
I worked so hard. I did this A, B, and C, and I did this and this and this.
And I'm making the majority of the money in the household and blah, blah, blah. And you don't take into account that I have to be there, via Zoom at X number. So you can acknowledge
a piece in that if you can.
A piece of that, right? So stepping to the side is trying to find that piece that you can acknowledge. Then you step forward and you acknowledge and you say, wow, I get it. I hear you are feeling really overworked and it's, and you're having your own feelings of being overwhelmed. And I completely, I get that. It's really hard and the pandemic's really hard right now. And then, so you've stepped forward. Now you step to the side and that's where you use an I statement.
Right.
So you're kind of coming back to the beginning of the box. So you're saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed about the kids' schedules and trying to keep track of that in addition to kind of the work that I'm doing.
Right.
And that box step can go around and around and around.
Well, I think I finally have it. I think I got it. You've talked about this before. The person's defensive, you step back.
Yes.
You step to the side, which is the listening part. Right. Are they saying, even though I want to knock their block off, let me listen.
Right.
Is there anything in there?
Right.
Oh, yeah, I heard that. So then you step forward. You acknowledge that. Yeah, you're right. You know what? You make a lot of money. You cut the grass, whatever it is. And then you step to the left to close the box and say all that, but I feel, right?
Yes. And here's what's interesting. You don't want to use the word but.
Because it negates everything. You want to say everything. And.
You want to say
right,
and.
Right.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
And that's, it's a technique that diffuses animosity. It's a technique that diffuses anger, defensiveness.
I just love it. It feels idealized to me though too. So what happens if you start throwing haymakers?
What do you mean what's a haymaker?
A haymaker is like a huge right fist, and like in boxing you throw a haymaker and then knock the guy out. So let's say you come to this and you're too defensive, you're too wound up, you're too resentful, and you start just lobbing haymakers, you start lobbing arrows at each other. How do you get out of that? Because I know what you said is that now you've set yourself back even further.
Yes.
But let's say that's what happens. I mean, I guess the most obvious thing to me was that you try to extricate, step away, just get out of that situation.
Right. We talk a lot when kids are little about giving kids timeouts, but what often is more important is that you take a timeout from your partner or from if a kid's lobbing stuff at you too,
Right.
You want to take a timeout, and that just means disengaging and saying, you know what, we'll have to come back to this. One of my favorite phrases for parents with their children, but also partners and spouses is, this isn't good for our relationship. What's happening here is just...
I thought you were going to say zippy the lippy, but...
Oh, that too.
But let's stay with this isn't good. This isn't good for our relationship.
This is not good for our relationship. I'm going to step out. That way...
And you could say that with your partner or your child, right?
Correct.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think one of the nice things that it does, Greg, is it puts the relationship at the heart of things and basically also communicates that you have a stake in creating a relationship with this person that is healthy and whole. So when you say, let's step out of this, this isn't good for our relationship, let's come back to it with cooler heads. It's basically saying, I love you and I want this relationship and I don't want to participate in something that's going to undercut it in some way or undermine it in some way. Thanks for listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with your family and friends. And if you'd like to hear more about Julie's work, join one of her parenting groups, or see about individual counseling, please visit parentinghorizons.com. Or you can email Julie at julie.ross@parentinghorizons.com.
See you next time.